I'd like to say good morning to everybody. I'm Roddy McNinch with Taurus Ag Marketing, and I'm here today with Curtis Russell, Mike Dolinsky, and Wayne Rolston. If you guys can each give a little wave, and I'm hoping everyone can see our panelists here. So what we're going to do today is we're hopefully going to have a great agronomic conversation on our second podcast. This is Taurus's second podcast in the post-COVID-19 era. With people working from home, with all the changes we've had, we like to get together and have what we call agronomic conversations. A lot of other people would call them agronomic arguments, but I think that's something that we enjoy doing, and we've had a number of customers say they enjoy taking part or listening to. So hopefully you enjoy our podcast today. We're going to welcome you to our podcast for the next 45 minutes to an hour. And hopefully you get something out of it. We're going to focus on plant health and what the 2020 season will bring. And what we really want to dig into is stress in plants. What causes it? What does it actually do to the plant, and how can we mitigate it? So we're hoping this podcast, we want to keep it as interactive as possible. If there are any questions from the audience, obviously there's a chat icon on the side of your panel. I would encourage you to enter any questions to anyone, and you can direct them at myself or any one of the guys in the webinar. Obviously, you can't actually talk to any of the four Taurus guys. We can only talk to each other, but I really would encourage you to enter as many questions as you can, or anything that you might want to discuss in regards to plant health, stress within a plant, and how can we mitigate it. And as far as mitigating it, there is going to be a focus on nutritional options, whether that's foliars, biostimulants, just nutrients in general. But really, we're going to try to come up with as many viable options as we can for you guys to put in the toolbox for the 2020 season. So before we get into it, I'm going to get all of our Taurus guys to introduce themselves, basically say who you are, where you're from, how long you've been with Taurus, or your role with Taurus, and we'll start off with that. So I'll lead off with Curtis Russell here. Curtis, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi there, I'm Curtis Russell. I started with Taurus in May of last year, so coming up on a year. I was with Bayer for 15 years before that, and was just looking at taking really the next step in agriculture and pushing the limits a little bit. I'm in a very progressive area where most growers are doing things right, and they're looking to be challenged to go after the next steps. And I think stress is something that in Western Canada, most plants are under. It's just the level of stress. This year we've got a beautiful seeding, but of course it's cold. We've got moisture to go into, and it's cold. So there's always seems to be something. And my old world was dealing with trying to apply herbicide to those plants under those stresses. So when it's okay and when it's not so okay. So.
Hi, I'm Mike Dolinsky. I was with Alberta Agriculture for 32 years and looked after entomology as the provincial entomologist for most of my career. I retired and went on to join AgriTrend as a senior agri coach for 15 years, and I've been with Taurus now as Director of Science and Innovation for about a year and a half. My major focus is plant physiology. I'm sort of a self-taught plant physiologist, and I'm really interested in how the actual plant functions and interacts with its environment. So that's kind of my role, to provide some guidance and some training. I spend a lot of my time with clients talking about training, and a lot of my webinars are posted for folks that want to look at. So that's my role, and I've been with them a year and a half and having a good time.
Thanks, Mike. Wayne, if you want to.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Wayne Ralston. I'm from north central Alberta, near Camrose, and I've been a sales agronomist for since 1989. Within the last 20 years, I've been trying to look at innovative ways to take a look at how we can procure more bushels from our crops, maximize as much of our genetic yield potential as we can, and in doing so, if we can produce more bushels, we can lower our cost per unit of production and enhance farm gate margins. So nutrition, I think, has been one of those aspects that's been maybe not looked at near close enough, and I think we can have all sorts of different tools in the toolbox to help promote better plant health and produce more bushels. Been with Taurus now for just over a year, and prior to that, been a sales agronomist in the industry for many years. Within the last 14 years, I've been working as an independent crop consultant.
Thanks, Wayne. And as I said earlier, you can direct your questions at any one of our individual Taurus guys or any one of our panelists, or just throw out a general question. We'll throw it to the group and get a conversation going. So let's get right into it. I'm going to throw up some maybe some controversial information right off the get-go just to get the conversation started here. We're looking at yield impact from abiotic and biotic stresses. This is real. This is research done by Bayer Crop Science. And we get an awful lot of questions. I mean, you look at the yield losses from abiotic stresses in particular. And when we talk abiotic stresses, I mean, we're talking things like temperature, soil temperature, air temperature, too much water, drought, salinity, herbicide stress. Herbicide stress is a big thing we're going to talk about today. I mean, a lot of controversy around herbicide stress, how much damage it actually does, how long that damage lasts, whether it speeds up a crop, whether it slows down a crop. I mean, herbicide stress is definitely something we'd like to talk about. And I just added this last one on here this morning because I think it's going to be a topic of conversation for the next week or so, is frost. With the temperatures out there right now, I think we're going to have a lot of people discussing frost, and then we get into the biotic stresses. I mean, this is something that Mike would obviously want to touch on. I mean, insects. He's the bug guy. He was the bug guy in Alberta for years. Viruses, bacteria, fungi, basically disease. So you look at the difference between abiotic and biotic stresses, and what that can actually relate to as far as yield loss. I mean, it's a big number. I know I've seen, I think the world record in wheat is around 230 some bushels, while NASA took away all abiotic and biotic stresses and grew 1,000 bushels per acre of wheat. So, I mean, you look at the potential, our genetic potential of what we actually can grow versus what we actually put in the bin at the end of the year. And obviously there's a big difference, and we see numbers like 82% reduction in yield by abiotic stress in wheat. I mean, that's a big number. And I'm never going to once claim that we can just eliminate these stresses, whether they're abiotic or biotic. NASA, like I said, they potentially can. I'm never going to say we can. In Western Canada, we have a short growing season. We deal with temperatures. We deal with short seasons. I mean, we do have a number of challenges in Western Canada. So I'm not going to say we can eliminate these stresses, but what I will say is we can mitigate them. So if we can capture that next tier, if we can capture that next 5% or that next 10%, if we can get to that next tier, or increase our agronomic knowledge to a point where we can recognize a stress coming and then plan for that with whether it's a foliar application or maybe a top dress application, whatever that looks like. I mean, if we can plan for that in advance, well, that just takes us to that next tier of agronomy. And I think at the end of the day, that next tier of agronomy is where we're all trying to get. So to lead us right off, I'm gonna start us off with a question. It was actually sent in before the webinar even started. This is just a very general topic, but what actually is stress in plants, or what does it do to a plant? And I think to answer this, we're gonna go to the Godfather, and I'm gonna get Mike to dial in and basically get him talking about what stress does in plants. And at any time throughout this, please feel free to ask questions or get something started as far as a controversial topic with the guys. So, Mike, I'll pass this on to you.
Okay. Any questions so far come up here? No.
We got nothing so far. You gotta,
okay.
you gotta get them warmed up. They're not responding to me as well.
Well, I think the frost question will come up before we're done, but I'm just going to quickly go through something here. I've been thinking about this in preparation, and Roddy mentioned that the genetic potential is massive, and I want to pose something for all of our listeners to think about. Is when we go across our landscape and we're harvesting a crop, we notice that the yield varies a lot. From the hilltop to the bottom, to where the acid soils are, to where maybe we got sand instead of good organic matter. So when we go across that field, we're planting the same genetics. So it's not the genes that vary that crop yield across the field. It's the habitat, that little habitat that each plant lives in, that is signaling the genetic potential of that plant in some fashion and dealing with those stresses. And if it's stressed with acid soils, with poor organic matter, with compaction, and so on, it really can't grow very well because it's dealing with all those kinds of issues. So keep that in mind. Really, what we're talking about is agronomists or plant physiologists, whatever way you want to look, is how do we influence the plant's little environment in the rhizosphere or in the shoot. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit to give you some background. And if you think about it for a while, for me, it changed how I'm going to actually look at what we do relative to a plant. So let's get some basic background here. I've only got 6 slides here to get through. But if we take a look at a plant, really what all it's doing is from the soil, it's taking up water and nutrients in solution. And it's taking up this group of nutrients, the essential nutrients that are required for a plant. So it takes it up into the leaves and it runs it through photosynthesis. So it takes the energy from the sun. It takes carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, the 3 major nutrients in a plant cell. And it all comes down to the cell for me. And it runs it through photosynthesis using all these nutrients. And I want to just point out some things here. We take a look at nitrogen, which is used the most, followed by potassium. Potassium's involved in osmoregulation, calcium in cell walls, magnesium in photosynthesis, phosphorus, and so on. And then we got all these micronutrients, copper, zinc, manganese, which are used in small quantities, but they're called transitional metals, and they're involved in all kinds of reactions. So the plant takes those nutrients along with water, carbon, and hydrogen. Next one, Roddy. And what does it do? It synthesizes every other molecule in the plant. Amazing. So it takes nutrients, runs it through photosynthesis with CO2 and sunlight, produces sugar. That's all photosynthesis does. But out of that sugar and nutrients, it biosynthesizes everything, all the oils, all the enzymes. There's all the carbohydrates, the lignins, and so on, and it feeds the respiration in the plant. And it does that all based on its genes. Next one. Now, the trick with genes is that a gene doesn't do anything. So people talk about upregulating genes and downregulating genes. Well, really, I know what they mean, and I want to go through that for you. But I need to identify a few things to make the explanation clear. Within a cell, we have the chloroplast where photosynthesis takes place, and we have electron transport, which causes a lot of the stress in the plant. We have mitochondria where ATP is also produced. There's only 2 places ATP is produced in the plant. It's in the chloroplast and in the mitochondria. And the other thing we need here is the nucleus. Now, the nucleus is where all the genetic material lies. And that's where the genes lie on the chromosomes and is involved in DNA. And the other important thing you have to remember is this thing called the plasma membrane around the cell. So if the gene can't do anything because all the gene is, or the DNA is the blueprint. It's reading the blueprint and causing something to happen based on a signal that's important. So how does the plant do this? Well, in this plasma membrane around the cell, right here, it has little sensors that are sensing everything around it, the pH in the solution, the level of the nutrients, the amount of oxygen there. And because this is impermeable, this is all phosphorus, the little blue dots, and this is a lipid in between. It's called the phospholipid bilayer. And then it's got transporters in this plasma membrane. So what the plant is doing is sensing what's going on, and then it sends a message and causes something to happen. And one thing we all know is we use a lot of ATP to do anything in the plant. Next one, Roddy. I'm abbreviating this to try and make the point. So here's the
keeping
general.
It simple, eh, Mike?
This is keeping it as simple as I can.
We do enjoy Mike keeping things simple.
Yeah, we don't want to complicate this any more than we have to. So here's how it happens. We have an environmental signal we talked about. It causes stress. It causes some damage in the plant. So it perceives the signal. It has a bunch of other transporters that pass the signal along, and we get transcription of the gene. In other words, the RNA makes a copy of that gene, and that gene is then, the response to that gene is activated, and we get a stress response. And some of those are influencing the osmoregulation in the plant. And these molecules are produced in large quantities to help the plant deal with loss of water, to deal with frost, or to detoxify things. It produces other compounds. It also regulates water movement through aquaporins and transporters. And then we either have cellular homeostasis set up again, and if we do, we get tolerance to that stress. Everything in the plant occurs in this fashion. There's a damage, a signal, a response by going and copying something in the gene. Next one. The hard part is done, guys, just so you know. But that's how it works. So here we have all those stressors. Go back one. We went too fast here. It takes a while. Okay.
Sorry,
so
Mike.
Here,
I got about a 3-second delay on the slides here,
yeah.
but yeah,
So,
we'll get it right.
Yeah. Here, and I'm gonna use an example of exactly how it does and the nutrients involved. Okay. We get all these stresses, including things that you do. You compact your soil. You kill it and get rid of your organic matter. You know, you have drainage problems, so you've got those kinds of stresses that are always there. So those, unless you remove those stresses in that environment of the plant, you're going to have some troubles. So those basic ones are there for a long time. Like I said, you know, in your good zones, you're getting whatever crop you put in there, it's good, because there's very few stresses on that plant. As you move into dry spots, into sandy places, there's a lot of other stresses. So each plant is up and down manipulating its genes depending on the environment that that particular plant and its cells are facing. So the first thing that almost always happens is we get free radicals occur, which are oxygen atoms that are damaged, and that's called oxidative stress. And the reason I use this is because it's the same in human beings. Next one, Rod. So we get all these damaging radicals here that need to be dealt with by the plant, and it does that. And here's how it does. And you've all heard of antioxidants. Well, the antioxidants that we use, the plant uses as well, and we get those antioxidants from the plants. So it has two choices. It can have non-antioxidant components like carotenoids. So what do we eat? We eat dark fruits. We eat grapes because of the carotenoids. Proline's an amino acid. Tocopherol is vitamin E. Ascorbate is vitamin C. And glutathione is a sulfur-based antioxidant. Then we have enzymes, superoxide dismutase, which can scavenge those free radicals. And then these break it down and we get more tolerance to abiotics. And this is the general common reaction that occurs in all plants in response to all basic stresses on the plant. And the last slide, I think. There it is. So Now we take a look at right down to the bare bones. We have these damaged oxygen atoms here, and then we convert that to hydrogen peroxide in many cases, and then we use things to get rid of them. And the key ones, and the same thing in human beings, manganese superoxide dismutase, which breaks them down, iron superoxide dismutase, and a copper zinc. There are other ones involved in it, but those are the key ones. So when we're talking about foliar nutrition and we're talking about fertilizing, always think of it, how are we changing the environment for that plant and providing what it needs in order to deal with manufacturing of the molecules based on the blueprint in the DNA to deal with those stresses. And you know what? On the whole, the plant knows what to do. All we have to do is try and help where we can. And that's the story. It's just that simple. The plant does it, but we have to make sure we provide those inputs and change that environment for it so it can do it. And the genes are all there. Plant will have 50,000 genes. Man only has 20. So it's got the blueprints to do everything it needs to do. Thank you. That's it. That's simple.
I think that's great, Mike. I'd like to actually. I want to go. I want to go back to one of your slides. Kind of right to the start. I mean, it's like Mike takes us to a level that most people don't get to in agriculture, and I mean that's one of the things we really like about it. But I mean, I always look at what I can learn from Mike, and then if I can simplify it to the point where I can understand. At the end of the day, I mean, he talks about how that plant handles stress and how it uses nutrients, water, sunlight to basically build up enzymes or proteins to the point where it can deal with that stress. I mean, that's actually how we're going to get into our first question. Our first question that's come out is, how do foliars actually help a plant get through stress? I'm gonna send this out to the group. Does anyone want to take this on? Wayne, how about we push this one on you?
So once again, I think, over the years and what I've been seeing is we've been traditionally fertilizing our soils to maximize our crop productivity. But just like an Olympic athlete, the Olympic athlete just doesn't eat breakfast and then expect to get his gold medal up on the podium later on. That Olympic athlete is feeding consistently throughout the course of his training or even race day. So he's definitely one of the elite or the true hybrids. So as we have, I guess, a demand put on our crops to try to proliferate more bushels and tap into more of that genetic yield potential, we need to think about what can we do differently outside of our conventional fertility program. And one of the things that I've looked at over the last 20 years is how can we complement a well-executed soil fertility program? And of course, a lot of times we're challenged with the input costs that we can put into a soil fertility program, especially if it's rented land. So what are alternative methods? And this is where you can maybe complement that soil fertility program with seed nutrient dressings, foliar nutrition, or perhaps maybe some nutrition, at flower and reproduction time. So a lot of times throughout the course of the year, we've only got 106 days to manufacture as much photosynthetic light energy as we can. So if, for instance, we're having to dip into that sugar cookie jar to overcome any stresses, whether they're abiotic or biotic stresses, that's obviously going to come at a bit of a yield drag for the crop. So whatever we can do to help feed nutritionally to that crop throughout the course of the season, just like the Olympic athlete would eat consistently throughout his training or even on race day, we're going to optimize better plant health, which means that we're not going to waste some of that sugar manufacture in that 106 days, and we're going to be able to walk away with higher bushels in the bin, which is job security for us all.
Well, I would look at it differently. I why would that surprise me?
I think that was great, Wayne. I agree with you 100%. But
how are you
I
different?
enjoy the conversation. Yeah, Mike, let's get another point of view out here, Mike.
Well, I look at foliar. We're talking foliar nutrition here, right? Foliar nutrition to me is a stopgap, short-term solution to a short-term, potentially a short-term or long-term problem. I look at a foliar nutrient as tricking the plant into thinking it has some nutrients that maybe it's missing. In other words, its environment is short of a few things. Now, the problem we have in most of agriculture is nobody's measuring it. For example, guys aren't tissue testing, which tells you what's going on. So if you're not tissue testing, you haven't soil tested, you don't even know what things the plant is actually missing to complete that. So we got to start going there. And on top of that, we haven't even measured water, which is the most important thing almost for a plant. But now we are, eh? So things are changing. So I look at it this way: if I give a plant a small amount of nutrition when it's under stress, and those nutrients change that environment because it's not translocating materials from the soil, and it can use those, what is it going to do with those? To me, it has to grow some roots. Because if it doesn't grow roots to access more nutrients in the ground within a few days after that small amount of nutrient that supplements the plant for a short time, it's going to be back in the same problem. Now, the plant can't deal with all the stresses, because if the stress continues endlessly, like a drought or frost or flooding, eventually the plant is just overcome. So that's how I look at what a foliar nutrient does. It deals with that short-term stress to get it over that period where it's not translocating nutrients, a frost, a hailstorm, a sudden heat stroke that occurs where plants will stimulate gene action. That's how I look at the role of a foliar nutrient package.
Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I think the biggest thing that can't be missed, and which was when I started at Taurus that I really enjoyed the conversation, was Wayne said complement your breakfast or your fertility plan in the spring. And I think your stress management starts in the winter time with what you're going to do. And I've heard all kinds of stuff that can be thrown in a tank, and it's going to be this, fix everything. It's going to improve efficacy and decrease herbicide injury. And, I think realizing that this is about a nice balanced, keeping that plant fed, keeping it healthy. One of the things that's nice about some of the foliars that are phosphate built is we do know that's a big stress across most of the West because of our zero till. So, but with that said, one thing we can all agree is nobody's on a farm saying you need to take phosphate out of your fertility plan and buy this instead. It's about building on that and doing more and doing a better job. And that's the part that I think can't be missed in this, is that foliar nutrition is a complement, not a replacement.
True.
So you're riding the fence between Mike and Wayne's answer is what you're saying then, Curtis. Is that accurate?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Yeah. I think there's too many times though where I've heard in the past, and why some people have a negative opinion in there of foliar nutrition, is simply because it's being sold as a replacement rather than a complement, and I think that needs to stop. Period. I think
I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think you look at a lot of the herbicide timing foliars out there, they are a heavy phosphate based. They're generally heavy phosphate based products. I mean, I look at what all three of you have said, and I agree with Wayne. I think it's part of a program. It's part of a top up. I mean, I look at Mike and we're talking about stresses today, so I'm going to kind of focus on what Mike said. But you look at the diagram we got on the screen right now. The photosynthesis diagram, I mean, Mike discussed it. A plant needs water and sunlight and nutrients, and it needs access to all these things to create photosynthesis. you put stress on a plant, and I'm going to pick on frost. I mean, because we are having some frost across Western Canada right now. You deal with some frost situation, and that root system shuts down. That means there's no more nutrients, there's no more uptake or translocation, Mike. There's none of that translocation up to the shoot or the growing point of the plant. And essentially, you've shut down that photosynthesis motor. I mean, the photosynthesis motor, extremely phosphate dependent, magnesium, potassium as well, but extremely phosphate dependent. I look at foliar nutrients, especially at that early season timing, those phosphate heavy products. I look at foliar nutrients almost as a jump start to that photosynthesis motor. Plant goes under stress, that photosynthesis motor goes to 100 RPMs instead of 1,000 RPMs or instead of 5,000 RPMs. You go spray it with a foliar nutrient or a foliar nutritional package, you're essentially force feeding that plant phosphate and a number of other nutrients, which is what it needs after something like a frost when its root system is shut down. You force feed that plant those foliar nutrients, and it's just like jump starting a car battery. I mean, you just turn over that photosynthesis motor. It gets some translocation going. It gets the roots pushing out exudates again. And by doing that, you're essentially growing that plant through a time frame where it didn't want to grow. So I agree with everybody as far as it's a top off to a fertility program. I mean, it's an agronomic tool, but I mean, when we're talking about stresses today, I agree with you, Mike, to the point where it's a short-term fix as far as getting the plant to the next stage in a stressful situation. And we've got a couple more questions right there. It's kind of related to that, but we've got a question in relation to timing of a crop. Will a foliar nutrient prolong my crop? Will it speed up maturity in my crop? I want to throw this at you guys while we're talking on all these different opinions on what an actual nutritional package can do in regards to a stressful situation. So throwing it out to all three of you, Wayne, start us off. Do you feel a foliar package can speed up, slow down? What's it doing to the maturity of the crop?
At the end of the day, we've only got, once again, 106 days to manufacture as much photosynthetic light energy as we can. And as Mike pointed out, our environmental conditions can heavily influence in terms of what kind of optimization of plant health we're going to get. If, for instance, we're into a cold and or frosty morning as a result, our plant metabolism is slowed down, and in order for that plant to get the metabolic energy that it needs, it usually comes from phosphorus. In a soil applied situation, how does that plant root system enable itself to get access to that phosphorus under, say, for instance, what we have right now, the spring cold and wet soil conditions? So, what's the nutrient availability to that crop? Or at herbicide timing, if, for instance, we're starting to see nighttime temperatures dropping below 5 degrees Celsius, that plant gets definitely cold and it wants to go into what we would call a stall state. So I think there's some opportunity when, with some of our conventional fertility products, especially on phosphorus fertilizer in the soil, when we get into conditions where that nutrient availability of phosphorus is not leading to metabolic plant health, and we get into a nutrient stall state due to lack of phosphorus nutrition, this is where maybe foliar nutrition can help to foliar feed some phosphorus into the plant to get that plant to continue to metabolize and take photosynthetic light energy, manufacture the sugar to grow the roots when it would otherwise be stalled. So when for instance, we get a short growing season and Mother Nature might present itself, we might see maybe 5 to 7 days earlier days to maturity because we've been able to optimize better plant health, have that plant grow through some of these stresses when otherwise it'd be in a stall state. And that could mean the difference between us harvesting the crop in fall or harvesting in the spring.
That's a great point. Curtis, Mike, anything to add there?
Not a lot. I think that the key thing for me is that we have to have the premise that the plants have got a good base nutrition package to start out with. If it hasn't got the macronutrient capabilities there in that environment for it to access and it's available. One of the big problems we have, and I'll use potassium because I'll talk about potassium when we get later in the season. But recent stuff shows that here in Alberta and across the prairies, Elston Solberg just did a study related to the work he does in Biosol, looking at tissue tests, and it showed that 57% of the crops were deficient in potassium, foliar testing of potassium, especially later in the season, and 51% were short of boron in the tissues. You know what? If you haven't got a good base fertility program, NPKs, and those nutrients, I just am afraid that a little bit of foliar nutrition is going to get you a short-term benefit, but man, to depend on that to carry you to improve maturity is not going to happen. If you've got that base and you're going through a period of problems, like you say, it needs phosphorus and it's not growing roots and it can't access phosphorus, or it's late in the season, it's dry, and we got our anions that really aren't going to move anywhere because there's no water to be had. You know what? That plant is going to have a difficult time. So it's and I think, Wayne, you said, you start out with breakfast, but that's just the beginning, and you got to have it there and have meals throughout the year. So that base nutrition and pHs and so on has to be fixed in that environment.
No, it's good. No, I agree with you, Mike. I've always kind of taken the mindset that a plant wants to grow through its life cycle. It's going to grow through its natural life cycle on its own. You add a certain amount of stresses, it's probably going to shorten that life cycle. If you can mitigate those stresses, you're going to allow it. You're not going to lengthen that time frame. You're not going to lengthen that lifespan. You're just going to allow that plant to grow through its natural life cycle. And I mean, that's always the opinion that I've always looked at when it comes to foliar nutrition. And I've got another question, and Mike, I'm sure you can see this on the bar, and I know this is something that you can hardly sit still but get in there to answer. So, Mike, I'm going to throw this one at you. We got a question on what is your opinion of seed-applied boron versus foliar-applied boron?
Seed-applied boron versus foliar-applied boron. Well, I'll tell you what. After all those years with Agrotrend and here with Taurus, we've used to focus a lot on going with a foliar boron application prior to bloom for a lot of reasons, usually pollen tube growth, and the need for and Marshner's book shows that we get a huge uptick in terms of boron demand when the plant is going into pollination, and that works. But more recently, and some of Chakmak's work has shown that the plant needs boron from the beginning. So if it's deficient late, it's probably deficient throughout that whole growth curve. So I have recently myself been doing a lot of stuff with boron, both in sulfur plus and just straight boron levels, to take a look at broadcasting boron. I've done testing with putting boron in furrow, and I would never put a 10% or 15% granular boron product in furrow with seed. It can be very toxic. Side banding, maybe using it in a foliar, in a liquid in furrow treatment, something like an alpine with boron, and it is fine and dandy. So I'm now a believer that if your soil test shows you're deficient in boron, your early tissue tests boron are deficient in boron, that you should be broadcasting boron and getting your boron levels up anywhere from 2.5 to 5 pounds broadcast, depending on the crop. And if you're even looking at crops, a crop like canola or legumes is going to use more boron, in my opinion, than something like wheat. So both will work. I prefer to feed the crop all the time, as we've discussed. We need that all the time. If you miss that or it turns dry just before you're going into pollination, and boron's an anion, so if you're not getting translocation, you're short, a foliar will do exactly what we said. It'll carry you through that gap between when there's sufficiency to maybe get it going until it rains or whatever, and we get that product moving through to when the plant needs it. That's how I look at it.
I think that's a great answer, Mike. And actually, that question was from Kathy. I'm going to echo something of what you said, but I mean, when I look at boron, a certain amount of boron goes into every single cell wall, or every single cell a plant produces, and it's trapped in that cell wall, meaning that plant really struggles to translocate it from the older growth point to the newer growth point in a plant. And I mean, because of that, whether you're talking soil applied boron or foliar applied boron, I'm saying both. I mean, depending on your situation, if you're soil deficient in boron, add some granular boron into the soil. If with that being said, even if you're supplying that granular boron, I mean, whether that's there, it's pretty mobile in the soil. So whether that's going to be there for flowering time, I mean, we have a spike in boron demand at flowering, and I mean, we know that. I mean, that might be where that foliar boron can fit. And there's Kathy, that's a great question. I actually want to bring this up, and I don't know how much of this you guys can see.
Not bad.
But it's probably not real good you probably can't see real well. But I wanna refer you guys to the Taurus product portfolio guide. And you look in our agronomy section, pages 11, 12, 13, and 14. We talked a lot about translocation of nutrients and when they come available. And I mean, boron, if you'll notice, I mean, boron's right at the top of the list in the sense that it does not translocate very well through a plant. But if you don't have one of these books at the end of the call, we will actually put the contact up for all of our Taurus reps. Don't hesitate to call your local rep and get some of that information sent out. It's a great agronomic resource. So that's a great answer.
I just want to chime in, just a word of caution. Just because you apply a boron to the soil or you have adequate soil boron availability, we need to be cognizant of the environmental conditions because, for instance, canola has a high affinity or a need for boron during flower and the reproductive phase. If, for instance, we get into cool, cloudy conditions where boron is in soil water solution and it moves by mass flow to the root system and the plant suck it up, under cool, cloudy conditions, your ability of that plant to suck it up is a whole lot less than when it's hot and dry. That when a plant's hot and dry, it's going to be able to suck more moisture or more water that has the boron in it with it from the soil. So under cool, cloudy conditions, although you have adequate boron within the soil, you might actually see a temporary boron deficiency because the plant isn't sucking up that water, in which case a foliar application of boron definitely helps to get that boron into the plant. So once again, foliar nutrition can help complement that soil fertility scenario, especially when you do reach some of those environmental scenarios.
And
Absolutely.
that's exactly right. I just want to make one point. For folks that are agronomists and so on, one of the things you may want to start considering is to moving some of your resources from soil testing to tissue testing, because all of this depends on us being able to measure. If we're not, otherwise we're guessing. So what I was thinking in preparation for this is suggesting to farmers and agronomists, take one field. If you're not tissue testing, and I hope you're soil testing, but if you're not tissue, take one field and do about 4 tissue tests throughout the year. And you will learn more about what your plants need, have, and don't have than you ever wanted to know. And you'll be able to really make some good judgments. And if you're really going to get on this thing, measure your water. If you start doing these things, then we will improve our ability to deal with that environment for those plants in a much, much better way. That's my take-home message, man. If you're not measuring, you're guessing.
That's a good point. That's a good point, Mike. And I'd actually say, something I do myself, if you are tissue testing, GPS reference that tissue test on top of a soil test. So you can start comparing that soil nutrition to that tissue nutrition. Sorry, go ahead, Curtis.
And I would take it one step farther. A lot of times we look for problems. We always go look at the problems, and there's something showing up, so we're gonna sample that. But in all reality, that's not the norm for your farm, or for your customers. So if you're gonna pick the bad, go pick a good too. I learned more trying to figure out what's going on in a field why one product worked or didn't by going and looking at the best parts of the field or the best fields or where things look good. So it's a lot of the practices are the same. Maybe even in that field, you know that the north end is better than the south. Don't just look at the south because you're trying to figure out what's wrong. Go see what's different from the good. And I would also say, like, we're probably not going to hit 250 bushel wheat in Western Canada. But
I'll have faith.
But, well, this year, we'll say this year. But we do have peaks in our yield monitors, and we know that, you know, I think that's the goal. I think when you see that spike on your farm of 125, really dig into why is that 125 bushels, and try to learn what you did to make that little, you know, maybe it's an old yard, maybe it's an old manure pile or something, but see what you did to make that happen. It's the good that will show you how to do the rest better. It's not usually the bad that gives you a lot of clues, because the plant's not able to do what it needs to do in those spots.
That's great. Great point there, Curtis. And we got another question here I want to get to. I think we got about 15 minutes left, and I would like to get this covered. So we got it's kind of a two-part question. Can herbicide cause stress to a crop, and if so, can a foliar nutrition actually eliminate that? Curtis, you're kind of our resident chemical expert, and I know this. I like throwing this one out there because I know if there's anything we're going to get disagreements between the three of you on, this is probably going to be it. So so I would say everyone pay attention, and let's listen to the different opinions here.
So, you know, I think we know that there is a level of herbicide stress on a plant. I think we could all agree on that. But I also know that many times a herbicide is sprayed and there's no concern. You know, that's measured. That's you know, literally percent of untreated is a calculation that's done by every chemist and every research scientist at every chemical company to try to figure out how much yield loss, if any, is attributed when you add that product. As a young summer student, I worked for Dow, and I was in research, and I was shocked to see that herbicides did what they did versus untreated. I didn't know that they did that, because what do? We spray the whole field, right? So then through my career, of course, I've got to see environmental conditions that can cause an increase in herbicide stress. I think a lot of times it's visual and not necessarily related to yield as much as we think sometimes. Certain products are worse than others. You know, Liberty is a great example of one that can give you what we call bronzing or flash with, well, in my experience, zero impact on yield. I've seen the old Puma Super days. I'm old enough for that, to see shortening of barley and conditions after cold nights that, you know, made me nervous as a young rep. And then when taken to yield, there was no yield difference, but there were maturity differences. So, you know, is there an effect? Yes. These plants are 99% of the time, or maybe, you know, maybe in Alberta it might be worse because of your cold nights, but in general, these products do work pretty good, but each product's going to be a little bit different. And, you know, I would say that a group 2 is more likely to cause more herbicide stress than a group 1 in wheat, for example. That's an example. Depending on your environment, man, it could be complete opposite if you've got a low 5-degree night and a 10-degree night. So,
no, that's great. So that's well, let's throw another opinion out there, Wayne. What's some of the experience you've seen as far as herbicide injury and what that relates to as far as foliar nutrition? Can we mitigate it? Does it actually equate too much, whether it comes to yield, maturity, or any of the topics Curtis covered?
Well, I think Curtis is right. I think it really depends on the herbicide that's being used. And then once again, what are the environmental factors that influence how that herbicide is working in the plant? if, for instance, you've got a barley plant that's got its feet wet, doesn't like saturated soil conditions, it's stressed right from the get-go. You apply herbicide to it. Group 1, as maybe Curtis alluded to, obviously we're going to be under heightened stress. If, for instance, we can metabolically help that plant, give it maybe some foliar phosphorus to give it some metabolic plant energy to help overcome some of that stress, then I think foliar nutrition can help that plant. It might not completely eliminate any potential crop yellowing or flash or stress, but what it will do is it will help the plant recover quicker from it, which means that if we've got limited days to maturity, maybe that might mean the difference between harvesting in the fall or having to spring thrash that grain. So at the end of the day as well, from my standpoint, every time we're into a stalled or stressed state, we're having to use some of that metabolic plant energy or waste some of that carbohydrate photosynthesis that we've been manufacturing to overcome that stress. And that's a yield drag. And at the end of the day, we need to be able to preserve as many bushels and as much sugar as we can, because that's our job security in terms of getting the yield. So I would tend to think that we can help to mitigate stress. A lot of times, in pulse production, some of the products can be a little bit harsh on some of the crops, in which case we can add foliar nutrition to help safeten up and or allow that plant to recover quickly when it's having to metabolize, for instance, some of that herbicide out of its system. So I truly believe that foliar nutrition can help. Can it eliminate flash or yellowing? Probably it might or might not. It depends on the environmental conditions, but I think there's some positives to be gained by having an improvement in terms of metabolic plant energy. One of the biggest questions is that can you quantify the metabolic activity of a plant to say when and how, or whether you should apply foliar nutrient or not? As far as I'm concerned, that plant goes through stress every day of its life until we actually take it off and seed.
It's a great answer. I mean, really, sorry, go ahead, Curtis.
Well, I think that's the part that's interesting. So they're not all created equal. High nitrogen-based foliar nutrition at herbicide timing. We told growers to add AMS to their velocity to increase weed efficacy, because that nitrogen and AMS it took more in. You don't want more product being taken in by the crop, active ingredient that plant, that crop has to process. So, I guess my skepticism sometimes in these products, and actually Craig and I had a lot of debates when I was the rep talking to his farmers about some of the products, was that make sure you understand what that product does, what its goal is, and don't just buy one and throw it in. There's a lot that are supposed to so-called safeten. And within the Taurus group, they read those labels and tell me that, well, that was going to make it hotter. So, just be cautious. Reach out to people. Try to get as much information as you can. I like that build doesn't have a lot of nitrogen in it, and I actually did a trial with Varo and Octane on durum to try to hurt the durum. And I was very pleasantly surprised with the reaction that I saw. It does not eliminate it, but it certainly made that durum look greener, less stunting, your typical group 2 symptoms that you'd see less. So
I would just make one, because we're getting near the end, for all those involved. One nutrient that I didn't talk about much, and because we just didn't have time, is sulfur. Sulfur is one of the key nutrients to deal with stress in the plant, in terms of especially something called glutathione, which is involved in the scavenging of free radicals, and it circulates in the plant continuously, and it's almost the first responder to scavenge up those free radicals, which my argument would be, if there is herbicide damage, I just about guarantee you got a lot of free radicals running around in those cells after you put on a toxic material, if it is toxic to the plant, that I'm no expert in that, and I never want to be on herbicides. And the other one that is also key, along with those micros, and I mentioned, is potassium, because potassium is involved as the primary nutrient along with water, and to a degree chloride, because you got to balance the charges, because that is what gives you the turgor pressure in the cells, and it osmoregulates the cells under a whole lot of conditions. And lastly, my last word is for frost, you guys. What happens when a plant is going under cold stress and frost is the plant produces a lot of what are called osmolytes. And the primary ones of those are proline, which is an amino acids, and other molecules, including glycine, betaines, and polyamines, which increase in the cells based on reading the environment it's getting cold. And the plant has built-in mechanisms to protect against frost to a certain point. And it depends on how fast the frost comes on. If it comes on too quickly, then the plant can't respond. So it's doing its darndest. And lastly, where you're going to see frost, if you're scouting in the near future and you get frost damage, is where you have heavy coverage of trash. Where you have black soil, you'll probably notice that you don't get nearly as much, at least that's my observation over the years, nearly as much frost kill as you do where there's trash, because in the daytime, that black soil warms up, it keeps it warmer at night, whereas where you got heavy trash. So you're going to scout in those two areas and look for what happens.
No, I think that's good. One thing I like about all three of you is, I mean, you talk about the situation. Curtis, you're saying, okay, a lot of these herbicides should not cause damage, but after we do spray them, there might be some free radicals, as per what Mike was talking about. But at the same time, Wayne's saying, well, these plants are under stress every day throughout the season. So I'm sitting there saying, is that herbicide might not cause stress, but if that plant is already under a 60% stress load and you go spray it with a herbicide, it's kind of like giving someone that's already sick a flu shot. I mean, their immune system isn't going to be up to snuff. So I mean, that's kind of where I look at the situational awareness, essentially, or agronomy. I mean, you can call it agronomy as far as situational awareness. I mean, if you can see stress in the crop, you're already too late. So I mean, looking at conditions, getting out, getting your shadow in the field. I mean, that's something we really want to encourage as much as possible. And I know we are almost out of time. We've got a couple more questions. I apologize. Mike, you touched on frost, and I know we've got a question about hail. We've got a question about flax, but we are running out of time. So maybe we can get to those questions in our next talk. One thing I do want to touch on is just the products that we're bringing out in for herbicide timing, these products that will be used over the next month as far as trying to mitigate some of these early season stress. Active Build, obviously, that's a product we have up on the screen right now. It is the heaviest nutritional analysis foliar on the marketplace. I mean, that's my go-to. That's my favorite point about it. Is, I mean, you're taking a shotgun approach of nutrients here and a heavy dose of nutrients. So you've got that heavy dose along with a synthetic biostimulant, something to regulate ethylene, something to try to mitigate that stress. And I mean, really, for the majority of herbicides, or tank mixing with the majority of herbicides, Active Build is going to be the way we go. Now, to carry on a little bit before we're done here, Curtis, I'm going to challenge you a little bit. I mean, we say that for the most part, we don't see a lot of injury or stress as far as herbicides, but we actually have a new product coming out this year. It's called Active VPR, Active Viper. This product specifically designed for use with Viper on pulses. Maybe you'd like to, well, I'm going to throw it at all three of you. Maybe you guys would like to touch on some of the experience you've seen as far as how that herbicide works within a crop, maybe some of the stresses related to it, or even how well it will enter a plant. Wayne, you want to start us off?
Yeah, you bet. Once again, I like foliar phosphorus. Once again, it's all about getting some additional metabolic plant energy in with that plant. And of course, the potassium helps to give you some of that environmental hardiness and water use efficiency that Mike had alluded to earlier. One of the biggest challenges with some of these herbicides is compatibility in the spray water solution. A lot of other foliar products in the marketplace just aren't compatible with Bazagran or with Viper. And let's face it, these are very popular herbicide products. So the last thing you want to see is a grower having a plugged up sprayer and he's down for several hours wasting good spray weather. So here it's nice where you've got that metabolic activity that's going to come from the phosphorus and then the potassium for environmental hardiness. Both phosphorus and potassium are also going to help complement not only overcoming maybe herbicide stress, but it's also going to help that plant to continue with photosynthesis to drive root architecture for further moisture and nutrient scavenging from the soil to optimize plant health. So I think it's a nice addition to the portfolio for the upcoming season.
Curtis?
I think one thing that's unique with pulses is that, you know, they're relatively new crops to Western Canada in the big scheme of, you know, chemistry around the world. So a lot of the products we use on pulses are not resistant. You know, even, you know, clearfield lentils might be the exception, but what we find is growers that could use clearfield lentils in some cases choose not to, for yield reasons and in a lot of cases, recrop and other issues. So most pulse growers have a higher tolerance for crop injury because they have to. It just is what it is. So, you know, they're experimenting, trying different stuff all the time. And I think for me, Bazagran has always been one that's made me very nervous from a tank mix side. So I'm going to be playing with this to see how we do, and if we can mix nicely in the tank and do a good job, you know, that's huge. So I think when we talked about some of the other products and herbicides out there in pulses, there's probably a few more that would consistently be harder on the crop, and most growers know that it's part of growing pulses.
I would just
being very, very political there.
Yeah, I can't speak on the herbicide, but I like this product because of the phosphorus. Because if we're going on its seedling and we're spraying and we get any stress on the plant and we take energy, the plant is also starting to nodulate, and that process of nodulation and the beginning of it is really important. A lot of times, even if the plants will stall simply when they start to nodulate and start fixing, because it's just taken so much energy to do that. There isn't enough there for that plant to grow, so we can get some stalls. So I think anytime you got legumes and there's any stress, the phosphorus is key, especially early in the growing season.
No, I think that's great. Well, that's really, we're past our point, or we're past our time frame allocated so far. So I think there's a number of questions we didn't get to. A shout out obviously to Scott, who's talking about soil health provides a large role in its ability to provide nutrients to the crop. Obviously, that's a big part of it. And I think we want to push that message. I mean, we talked a lot about foliar nutrition today. I mean, we talked about active build with a number of our herbicides. We talked about active VPR, Viper, and some of those more aggressive herbicides. But like Scott had mentioned in the chat room here, I mean, I think there's an awful lot that goes on even before herbicide timing, or like Wayne had talked about earlier. It's not just a simple fix. There are so many different factors that come into play here, whether it's nutrient package up front, the conditions, frost, moisture, hail damage. I mean, there's so many things that come into play. I don't think this is just a quick fix, but I mean, it's something that we can use to help mitigate that 60 to 80% of abiotic stress losses we get throughout a growing season in Western Canada. So with that, as I said, we're past our time frame. Before we sign off, I'd like to thank everyone that came on the podcast. Obviously, I'd like to thank our panelists and guys for being on here. Obviously, it's great conversation. I'm just going to try to get our contact info up. So thank you guys. And there's our contact info. It should be showing up on your screen. If you want some Taurus product portfolio guides, if you want to talk a little more about frost injury, frost stress, hail, herbicide injury, whatever it is you want to talk about, by all means, please contact your Taurus rep. Even if it's something as simple as getting some product portfolio guides and looking at different nutritional packages we have throughout that book. Please don't hesitate to do that. Everyone be safe out there, and thanks for joining our second podcast. I'm sure there will be more to follow.